We will have more folks joining us, but thought we should get started. My name is Jennifer Jones, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Prevent Child Abuse America. Thank you again for joining us today for the PCAA America Zooming Out speaker series. Prevent Child Abuse America embarked on a comprehensive adaptive strategy process in 2022 to set a vision for the creation of a primary prevention ecosystem in the United States that builds on the well-being of our nation's children and families. To provide clarity and focus in this process, we have developed a bold theory of change to help guide us and our nation as we develop the best strategies and policies for achieving our shared goals and ensuring that all kids and families live purposeful and happy lives with hope for the future. The PCAA America theory of change represents a comprehensive, evidence-based, and bold prevention framework that can guide not only the work of PCAA America, but also the broader prevention field, our partners, and policymakers well into the future. Our process has been intentionally inclusive, including a deeper engagement of families, our network, and our partners. Our theory of change development process included design sessions, interviews, and surveys that engaged over 475 individuals representing families, Prevent Child Abuse America staff, our board of directors, home visitors, Healthy Family America leaders, state chapter executive directors, and other national thought leaders. We also launched a national survey of over 1,200 adults to gain better insight about what is important to families and caregivers relevant to our theory of change. We listened, and there's overwhelming support for efforts that provide equitable opportunities that promote the health and well-being of all children and families and communities in our country. The purpose of today and this Zooming Out speaker series is to help inform our theory of change by better understanding the context and the environment in which we do our work. We are incredibly excited to have Raquel Hatter from the Kresge Foundation with us today. She will share her insights on what will be critical to our success as we move to create a primary prevention system. Today's conversation will be facilitated by Susan Dreyfus, who has supported PCAA America throughout our adaptive strategy process. Most recently, Susan served as the president and CEO of the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities and secretary of the Washington State Department of Health and Human Services. Susan is a recognized national leader in health and human services and child welfare. I've had the privilege and honor of working with Susan for the past 22 years, and we are incredibly fortunate to have her continuing to work with us and throughout our adaptive strategy process. Susan, I will now turn it to you.
Thanks, Jen. I just have to first say, since I'm a lot older than you are, I can sit back and look at you when I first hired you back in the late 90s. And girl, look at you now. It's really awesome, really awesome. Well, first of all, I just have to do a shout out to Jody Levison Johnson. I was just so excited to see her there. As you know, with the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities, as I was coming out as CEO, and sometimes in our sector, when CEOs are leaving, it's a good time to think about the future. And maybe it's time for an exciting new merger. And we did our merger with the Council on Accreditation. And today, Jody, I am so thrilled that she, as both successor to the Alliance, but also with COA, but the creation of Social Current, which is a new and exciting organization in our country. So anyway, shout out to Jody. It's just wonderful that you're on with us. So my sister Raquel, we've known each other over 20 years. I remember when you were not yet CEO of Whaley Children's Home in Flint, Michigan. I remember walking the streets of Flint with you. And I knew then that I was with somebody that had a true head and heart connection to the work, to the field, and understood the larger role of the social sector, that we're more than just nonprofits in this country, but a bold third sector in this nation. and we're created for a purpose bigger than our contracts in terms of the role we play in a free, just, and civil society. And Raquel and I have gone back and forth between social sector work to government work and back again, but always through that time, we kept our sense of humor. We always loved one another, and we were always there for each other in the good times and the bad. So Raquel, it's just wonderful that I get this opportunity to be Oprah for a minute and engage in a conversation with you. So thank you.
Thank you as well. Good morning.
So I want to kick us off with a question, and I want to say to everybody that's on here, welcome, welcome. And if you have any questions, comments, please use the chat and make this a lively conversation. And if you have questions, I'll get cued on that and make sure that I pull them into the questions I'll be asking Raquel. But knowing Raquel, she's going to take this in some bold and daring directions. And that's exactly what we want, because we want Prevent Child Abuse America to lead the way on what really it's going to take to make sure all children and families in this country thrive. So Raquel, when we first had our call with you, Jen and Kirsten and I, we had a call with you, and I love when you said, which again, with all you've done in your career, here you are now managing director at Kresge Foundation, doing phenomenal work. And you talked about your own journey, that you've been on your own journey, your own, personal and professional journey. And regarding inequities in this country and what it's going to take to truly eliminate them as a nation. And I wanted to know if you would just open us up with a personal glimpse into that journey that you are on, as you are trying to think about the greatest contributions the Kresge can make and what you guys are hoping our field, and predominantly in this session, we're hoping to really put a spotlight on the social sector and the larger role as 501c3s that we can and must play.
Sure. No easy questions from you this morning, Susan. So thank you.
I sent them to you.
I just want to warn you that you all invited me. And so I was thinking about when you describe what I might say as bold. And I don't think of it that way. I do my work driven by my personal faith, as you know, and see the work as purpose driven. And also, I think that the families and communities that we all care about are in positions of where we have to create the space where they are the ones who are driving things. And I'll talk more about that. So I don't find it bold to say now what I've learned and understand. I think I have an obligation to be clear whenever I have the opportunity to do so. Perhaps earlier in my service, that wasn't the case. I will say that given the title in terms of the social sector disrupting the status quo, as individuals, status quo has never really been a thing I would say about myself. So I'll say that for certain. And when I was thinking about this question, one is just candidly, as a Black woman in America, in recent years, I've learned a lot more about, with precision, about what structural and institutional racism looks like in systems, as you all discuss in many of the materials that you sent about the work that happens through this network. And as I was reflecting back, I remember when I was a frontline practitioner in child welfare and being perplexed about why things had to be the way they were with regard to kids and families. And sometimes when you're on the front line, you really don't know exactly what the barrier is. And so I recall different times when we have parent agency agreements, things of that nature. And I remember situations where there was substance abuse, and there'd be reasons why kids couldn't talk to their parents based on some type of a positive test, and then observing how kids would respond when they couldn't see or talk with their parents and families. And it was odd to me because what you would notice, and this is me as a clinician, you would see an increase in anxiety for obvious reasons in terms of kids worrying about their parents and vice versa, and how that would be understood maybe sometimes more as a behavior issue or a not readiness or a failure on the part of a family. And so, and not really looking at it through a systems lens, or even at things such as the implications of poverty and the historical conflation between the two. And then when you consider those things, you look at what are real and true barriers from an equity standpoint, especially through a race lens, when it comes to income and wealth in this country. And what did that mean for families that we were serving then and now? But that just wasn't a lens that we embraced. Or when you think about the idea of children and families, especially when you're looking at permanency or some type of reunification, the divestment that happens just by virtue of a child being removed with regard to child support, if in fact that's occurring, or TANF if families are receiving that. And yet we're saying that we want them to be together. And then I think a final point I'll make is when you think about narratives in this country, particularly as it pertains to BIPOC families and families who are under-resourced, but probably I would especially say BIPOC with regard to the characterization of families being broken. And in my view, and I think many others, it is not uncommon for the way America has responded to families, that part of that strategy has been to break down families, candidly, going back many years. And so as I think about that, the other piece that goes with that is the issue of mass incarceration and what that means for families in the long run with regard to their well-being and economic security. So there's a number of things that I see that I didn't see then, that I see now, which puts Kresge in the seat that I get the opportunity to serve in as a human services leader, and having the obligation to look at all those systems and how they intersect specifically in the lives of families on the front line and in community. You're on mute.
Unmute. There you go. Just to follow the thread line as you closed up about now what you're doing at Kresge, and you gave me the ability to serve on that first national advisory group to the launch of the next generation organizations with a focus on these social sector organizations across the country. But now you're into multiple waves of cohorts in that, creating quite a formidable learning network, innovation network throughout that process. Raquel, what are some of the big takeaways that Kresge is having in the next generation initiative that again, that's been going on now for a number of years. Mm-hmm. What are some of the big takeaways you've had on both the realities facing our field and our sector, but what happens when these organizations truly do start to lift up and practice? I think all our sectors, I always say our sector exists, yes, for our excellence, but we also have to think about what is it that's making us distinctive, and what is it that's giving us outsized influence and advocacy, whether it's for one child or the entire nation. And I think that fundamentally is probably the paramount role of the sector, is its advocacy responsibility. So just some thoughts on the journey of Kresge with the next gen, and some of the takeaways that you guys are having, or some of the questions you're starting to continue to ask that you want to go further on.
Sure, I'll comment from my three lenses. I'll say one who's worked in a nonprofit or a social sector, which I know is the preferred term that you like. I just got to get used to saying it that way, Susan. And then as a social sector chief exec in more than one state, and as a state commissioner as well, and now at Kresge. The social sector, in my observation, is far more powerful than I think it gives itself credit for. And I think from time to time, maybe I can say this because I'm a part of the in group, a bit passive from time to time. And these are some of my observations. I'll get to some of what I see as highlights. And perhaps in some ways too reliant on the public system to understand how it all works. So I think that the public sector itself is one way to learn about how it works. However, as being a social sector leader or organization, there's an obligation to understand the system beyond as public sector lens through the public sector itself. So understanding how rules, laws, all those things get made at local, state, and federal levels. And we'll find, I think oftentimes when people go deeper on their own, or with folks they connect with who can do that with and in partnership with them, like Social Current, I think that people then begin to discover what is possible, what actually requires permission versus that that does not require permission. And I think being a student of that is really important. At Kresge, through our Next Gen work, it's been really amazing. In fact, Susan, our last cohort was social sector organizations and public sector organizations. So that was really, really cool. But one of the things that has come out of that is the importance of, we always talk about this, the public-private partnerships. But in this instance, it's not just the typical thing that we would say. Like, we really spent a lot of time with the cohort members talking about what that actually looked like. Like, what are the enablers to effective public-private partnerships? And I have some notes because we actually have a, I'll try to remember to give you, it's the nextgenhumanservices.org. We call it a field building site that you should check out to learn more about what I'm talking about specifically. But one of the things we discussed, and it's not unlike, Susan, what you and I discussed years back when you came to Tennessee and I was there, establishing, leveraging each other's strengths is one thing, because fundamentally we want to go past this contractee vendor kind of relationship to understand the relationship is far more than that. I think at one time we called it partnering for purpose. And then we also discussed identifying the shared values and building trust as a key component, and in creating an atmosphere for what I like to call intense fellowship, or differences in perspectives. And I think moreover, it's all centered by the commitment to children and families, all those elements. Like, you don't come together just for the sole purpose of establishing a contract and going beyond that and having to be centering families. I think another thing that we've noticed is when I go back to like the policy piece. Some of the organizations, just because they have so much going on or they're very stretched, oftentimes that's not their strongest suit. And so we are seeing more organizations, social sector organizations, develop that muscle and in connection with maybe larger entities who actually advance a policy agenda. And we see that as something that is improving. And moreover, it's informed by the families and communities that they serve. So it's in partnership with. Another thing that we're seeing is like real sincerity and intentionality with co-designing with families. So it's not just a typical satisfaction survey, how did it go, what can we do different, but fundamentally, and families being compensated for it. So I'm not even talking about the old school gift card or something of that nature, but really and truly acknowledging and honoring the power that families hold. And we're seeing a lot of families become leaders in the space themselves to inform.
You know, I think about one of our former Zoom sessions, and these Zoom chats have been amazing in this process, because I think it's just lifting us all up to, as Ron Heifetz says, listen musically so we can then think analytically about the work we have to do. And this is a great contribution to that. But I remember in a past Zoom session, we were reminded that in technology, when there is an innovation in technology, before it's ever going to see the light of day, all the powers that be have to know that it's going to truly meet a customer need, and that the customer has been integrally involved in the design and in the development and in the testing, and believes that what you've ultimately created will deliver, right? And I think one of the things I'd like you to go a little bit deeper in is the challenge of what it means to truly be engaging of families, and what it means to be co-designing. Because I always talked about, where are those real-time feedback loops? You walk out of Kohl's and within seconds on your app is, how did it go today? I called Delta Airlines, and immediately the one question is, would you hire this person? I mean, the amount of real-time feedback loops that we don't have in our field and in our sector. So maybe just a little bit deeper in that, because that's a real commitment of this theory of change, is that PCAA America intends to deeply engage families in all aspects of the organization and of its work.
Sure, thank you. And I think most people have heard at least about human-centered design. So it was that plus, it's not just that. And that families and children become integrated in the way the work occurs. I had an opportunity to moderate a panel which didn't require a whole lot of moderation, actually, of parents who do leading work in the field now or in this space last week. And the title of the panel was Putting Parents in the Driver's Seat. And so I was thinking about the title that I didn't name, but I thought, have you ever been in a car as a passenger and you wish you were driving? So like you want somebody, you might be on your side, pushing the accelerator or the brake. And then somebody's like coming to get you to take you to a destination that you need to be at, and they're going the wrong way. You don't feel safe. You're not in charge. And that's what families feel like. So ideally, you want to put the keys in the hand of families. I use that example because it's very plain, yet we can all identify with it. And that's just in a car, you think about somebody's overall family life and their future, that is essential. So it's more than, I think the feedback loops are important. Even things like families training us, like there's a certain set of competencies, I can't identify them all. And some of them I have this acronym, you hear the term make it make sense, I call it MEMS. And I think that's what we have to do is make it make sense, but we can't make sense out of it absent families. And so often families, when they are invited, is still not, there's a difference between diversity, inclusion, and equity. And you're not at equity until the power is being acknowledged and honored. That's the bottom line. You can be at a table, it doesn't mean that you're even included. And if you're included, it doesn't mean that the power is being shared. And that's what's really essential. And in order to do that in terms of competencies and self-awareness and emotional intelligence, it takes all of that. I'm of the belief that you really don't know if you're doing that until a family tells you you are. Like we don't get to decide that any particular group that's been historically marginalized and oppressed is better off. That group, only members of that group can tell us that. So we have to measure our progress through the lens of families. And when you think about things like data, that families have a say about what data about themselves is tracked, it should be relevant to what they want for themselves. That's important. And there should be ways for families and parents to hold the system and organizations and the individuals they work with accountable. And so we're seeing a number of our partners really doing that. And then also identifying, and that's in the link that I mentioned, the behaviors that go along with acknowledging power, treating folks with dignity and respect, and recognizing the agency that folks bring. Those are all words that we know, but what does it really look like when you are actually doing it? And so that information that we share came from partners who are part of our Next Gen in both the social sector and the public sector. And it was their staff on the front line who provided the information in terms of what does it actually look like and how do you do it?
Oh, that's awesome. We've just put that link in the chat. So everybody that's out there, I hope you grab that and we'll reference it. So, and I have to tell you, looking back in my public sector work, both in Wisconsin and in Washington State, and having had responsibility for child protection, and I'm careful not to call it the child welfare system because I don't think this nation has a system that builds the welfare of children, and child protection is but one function within it. But I think knowing that, first of all, if we just take off the table, what family doesn't want their children to be safe? I mean, it's like, come on. So if you just kind of take that off the table and you look at the design of today's child protection function, if families were designing it with the understanding that, it's meant to be there so that children are safe. When children are not safe, we need to make sure they are, right? But how do we do that? And I just wonder how very differently the child protection function would look if families were at the center of its design.
Right. It's interesting because I'm always wrestled with terms like, I understand why we use them, but I wrestle with terms like protection and prevention. Inherent in the terms is the assumption that something is going to go wrong. And now we know that things do go wrong, but that's starting from a place that at some point, something's going to go wrong for kids and families. And we recognize that is likely true, but that's the orientation. So the orientation isn't the long view in the first place. And I think it's challenging when you try to shift that paradigm because of the issue of safety and the things that do go wrong and the fear of something going wrong. So somehow we have to, I think families don't make those assumptions about themselves. I think that if families were involved in terms of the vision they see for themselves and their families, it would be different in terms of what we think about. And to be clear, and we can't look at, one of the things I always see is, apple doesn't fall far from the tree, all those kinds of things that would be said. But it was outside of a systems lens and looking at the other implications. So for example, when you think about policies or even the issue of fathers being marginalized across systems, and especially fathers of color, that's a factor. And when you think about women, moms, women in particular who face a wealth gap, an income and a wealth gap, and moreover for women of color. These things are really important in the life of a family. So it's bottom line is we can't look at families through one lens, and we have an obligation, even if we are not in that very specific space, we have an obligation to look at the family as a whole, because we get the privilege to be in somebody's life and to make to have authority that's undeserved, in my view, to weigh in ways that have lasting implications on the lives of children and families. And that's one of the reasons, Susan, as you know, that we adhere to the 2-gen or multi-generational social and economic family success model with 2-gen being our central tenet, because in that it holds so many things, including well-being and health and social capital. All those factors that have not traditionally been a part of the conversation. I was thinking back, especially with Jody being on the line and you, when we were doing work in systems of care and family-driven youth guided, we're making those efforts. We talked about cultural linguistic competence. And I think and that was a great start. However, I think one of the things that is missing is understanding how injustices show up, understanding it through a historical lens, and recognizing that what we see today are just the indicators of historical injustices and inequities that have been there. So I think it's really important for social sector leaders and organizations to have the vision and the right glasses to be able to see what inequity looks like in policy and practice.
Well, listen, you're going to love this. There's something in the chat. It says, authority that's undeserved. That's a sermon. So coming up next after this episode will be
where I'm from, all authority is delegated. So
yeah, that's right. But listen, you really just crystallized the PCAA America theory of change, and it's bold, it's daring. It's saying that our fundamental role and responsibility is to create a true, equitable primary prevention ecosystem in this nation, and to not let child protection be the rudder that determines our success in this, right? It's got to be radically different. And so one of the things that when you were, you have had a lot of work with national organizations around the country. I think about your long embedded partnership with the American Public Human Services Association, our dear friend Tracy Waring-Evans, yay Tracy, give us some guidance as a national organization that's really adaptively, and adaptive change, this, right? You're an adaptive change agent yourself. It creates dissonance by design in order to pull us all to higher ordered thinking and purpose and change. So talk about your experience with national organizations as you have worked with them. Ascend, I think about Ascend, so many others, and any guidance that you would give this network. So many of the people on this call are integral to PCAA America. So many of them are part of their chapters and in their network, or are team members on the PCAA America staff. So I just want to step back and say, give a national organization your lens of what it takes to equip the field, to equip policymakers for this bolder vision and change.
Well, I think one thing I would say first is that there's a need for there to be a symbiotic relationship between national and organizations that are on the ground. That it's a both and that there has to be a realization, appreciation from what organizations on the ground bring, because they're proximate to people, place, and the problem. And so I think anything that a national organization is doing needs to be well informed by families and leaders on the ground. Very specifically, I think it's important to also be aware that there's sometimes this debate going on about the role of larger organizations versus smaller organizations in community, and which ones can have the greatest impact. So I think it's important to know what you are good at, and perhaps the things that community is good at, and they should be doing, and not the national organization. And figuring out what the roles are of each, and not operate in a way that suggests that because one is bigger, that is better. That's something that I think is really important. One of the things that we're seeing on the issues of equity and justice with regard to national organizations, APHSA, Social Current being two case in points, we work with them very closely. The work that they're doing, to use terms like boldly, is the internal work that they're doing to really understand what's happening in their organizations from an equitable standpoint, and their own practices just as leaders, and with their staff, and then what that looks like externally, and being really, those aren't easy things for people to pull out, to pull off. And also looking at, I think what I would say, I see a lot of organizations doing a lot of organizational introspection, and how really being honest about ways in which they've been complicit, and we all have as an organization or institution. There's just no way around it. So there's no, the question is, how is it manifested in your organization, or how does bias show up? As our friend who you met, Susan Yolo, Alika Robinson, when he did work with us when we went to EJI a few years ago. And I think that those are some of the things that we're seeing. And then I think one of the things that we have done as well is to identify signals of systems progress, because in today's America, it's really noisy, and it's hard to know and to capture and remember the things that are going well and that are working. That's going to be really important, especially in an environment where there's likely going to be a lot of risk for disinvestment in things that are really important for families. So I think it's important to also identify what is actually working. There's a lot of great stuff happening in this country with people doing workarounds, though, right? Because we've discussed like what we call the human service value curve, and at the bottom of that is like doing what's required, like being compliant, whatever the sector may be. And even when you do all that, it doesn't necessarily mean that families are better off. I think that national organizations can be very supportive in helping folks to think different with regard to that paradigm shift. And so many, whether it's the public sector or the social sector, are really concerned about doing well on audits. I think that's fine. At the same time, we have to be we have to observe the things that are mandated, but don't make a difference. And then not be content with that or complacent with it. So we have to, while doing the things that we're required to do, to also be strategizing about why a thing should or shouldn't be fundamentally.
So that's a great segue into a reality, because part of our process has been, we've also been interviewing national leaders on a bipartisan basis to really hear, right, all voices into this process. And this is a bipartisan organization. The alliance that I led, that Jody now leads, is a bipartisan organization. Tracy, APHSA, right? And you find yourself needing, especially when I know for me, I'm 65 years old, and probably the biggest pain, but yet blessing, has been my openness to understanding ways without intention I have been complicit in the systems that I had responsibility for, that I thought I was reforming, right? But I was really being complicit in systems that were deeply entrenched in systemic racism, no doubt. So I mean, I really love that you're calling that out, because it's okay for us to go through that journey of recognition and doing something about it, but let's talk about, this is a bipartisan organization.
That's right.
Needs to be able to speak across both sides of the aisle, has chapters in very conservative states and governors and legislatures, and the whole spectrum. And we also bear responsibility as a national organization to move a different national narrative. So, that all sounds well and good, and you go, okay, so how do we do that, right? Especially in this political environment. So I just want, you've been at this for a while, you've watched a lot of folks. Could you have any insights, any suggestions on how, as a bipartisan organization, because this theory of change anchors race equity, fairness, justice, any kind of inequities, whether it's geography or gender in this nation. And we've got to lift that up in a way that people can hear and don't just polarize on us and then not respond. So lessons learned, thoughts or suggestions you have. Boy, I tell you, if I could do it all over again, here's something I'd be doing. But that would just be helpful, I think, to all of us, not just for PCA, but everybody on this call.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. And one that I think about often, because now I think I don't even know if polarization is the right word for whatever we're experiencing, because I most certainly, I think we would all agree that no family is disposable, at least on this call. I have to be honest about that. And we certainly work with a lot of, especially policy shops that are in different places geographically, who all also agree that there's some serious issues of inequity in the country. However, they have to figure out how best to talk about depending on the social political landscape where they are. A lot of what we discuss is the use of data that oftentimes could speak for itself. Well done. I think that, I was a commissioner in a southern state, and I think data that's accurate and that reflects what's equitable and what is not can speak for itself, and I often utilize that. I think that, Susan, because so much of the polarization has little to do with things that might matter significantly for families, I think that organizations like this one and others have to figure out where they stand on issues. I think given some of the things that have happened, it's going to be tough in terms of I think we have to land, I don't even know if I would think of it as bipartisan. I think it's people, it's about people. Because it's too many issues, it's too many things that are happening that we took for granted. And it's a host of things that you can name, but nonetheless, we do know that things that we once thought were certain aren't necessarily. And so there's some things we simply cannot afford to lose. And so I think that many organizations have to decide where they're going to stand on those issues. And some things won't allow for neutrality, candidly. And for me, it's not political. And so I don't think that's the issue. I think it's more about what families need and should have rights to. And in order for, we know, to have a strong country, we need strong families, strong communities, and a strong country, candidly. And that's one of the reasons why we adhere to a 2-gen approach, which is when you poll it, is highly bipartisan and very much supported. And I think any state, any governor can see themselves in that if you know your landscape. I think that approach is a good way to think about it, because you have issues of post-secondary, K through 12, early childhood, social capital, health and well-being. The extent to which any place is adhering to those aspects and the principles that drive it, I think is something that folks would listen to with the prerequisite that they're rational, candidly.
That's a good prerequisite. Yes, I really like that, though. I really like that. That this isn't about partisanship; it's about people. And you said one of the things we know we can all agree on is that no family is disposable. We all want the best for kids and families. And I think what you're saying is, if your data can speak for itself, and you're clear on what it is you're ultimately trying to achieve. And that is, the greatest strength of this nation is its people. And
No doubt.
when we all do well, we all do well. So, I mean, there's just no doubt about that. But the other thing you said too is, but also be, because it takes courage, right? Because you're up against some headstorms that are, are real, but have courage to know where you stand. Right. And I know when I was CEO of the Alliance, our policy team did a phenomenal job of going around the country with our network and being clear on what our policy principles were.
Mm-hmm.
And that proved to be more important over time than the ever-changing agenda. Because what it allowed us to do is quickly and courageously take stands, right, on issues without processing them to death, because they simply were in violation of a principle that we held.
Right.
And I think those are three really great nuggets of advice. So thank you very much for that.
Susan, one thing I would like to add, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think the piece around fundamentally, I think like we're up against some value contradictions. And when it comes to people specifically, I think one of the things, and another observation we're seeing, whether it's at the national level, but most certainly at the local level, is putting up, as one of my colleagues would say, Dr. Aisha Nandoro in Jackson, is putting the pen in the hand of the narrators, and that is the people themselves, families themselves. And as we learn more, this feeling like, not even feeling like, just the idea of things being extracted, like information and solutions from families and communities on the ground, but putting them in the driver's seat, putting them in the op-ed seat at the tables specifically. And I think some of that has to do with, like, there's a difference between being charitable and having an asset-based lens or values lens. And we're not approaching families and communities as though they're not capable or don't have agency. And what we're trying to do now, hopefully, and some folks say they are doing this, is to recognize the strengths that they brought all along. Oftentimes, I think that, in my own story, I know what it is to struggle. I know what it is to struggle less. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. I had thyroid cancer as a child, and I've been a victim of intimate partner violence. I know what it is to struggle and what it is to struggle less. So I know what's possible. And so I think that really recognizing that we all have gifts and talents, and from time to time, or more often for others, things get in the way of people realizing what they're actually capable of. It's not that they're not capable, and it's not that families don't want better. It is accurate to say that there are things in the system by design, candidly, that interfere. And I think that more than just saying that, it's important to educate ourselves about what it looks like. I mean, those are just facts. It's not anything that's being made up. And I think once people can understand that in a clear way, it becomes, it creates less dissonance, I'll say.
It's a really interesting idea when I think I kind of like that, wow, I should have had a V8 moment. I wish I could go back to when I was CEO of the Alliance, because when you think about your advocacy, just imagine if Prevent Child Abuse America and every one of its chapters had family members who were able to then come out to DC to sit in that congressperson's office with the staff. That it isn't a question of just once in a while, it's a question of being an integral partner and member of the team. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah,
so I want to ask you a question. And that is, now you're sitting in the seat of philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes all of us to move this, right? When you think about not just Kresge Foundation, I'm asking you to take a larger, lens to the whole philanthropic sector. But what do you see that's giving you hope? What do you believe we could do a better job of as organizations who have a clear interdependency with philanthropy to create the country we all want to see? Give some insights, some things you've learned, and any guidance you would give us as we think about the fullest engagement of our philanthropic partners in advancing this work.
Sure. Well, first I'll say, as someone who's now found myself as a part of my path in the philanthropic sector, and that one of the things we're doing first in general and at Kresge is really looking at the role that we've played when it comes to inequity and in equitable access to capital, specifically with organizations on the ground and BIPOC leaders specifically. That's been one thing. I think that, I had a conversation with a reporter recently around some of the efforts that we fund. And really and truly, with regard to philanthropy, and in our view, it exists to support things that are innovative, that are game-changing, and that probably wouldn't ordinarily be supported by current dollars that folks may have. And it's for the purpose of being an influencer to affect systems change in the long run. I think something else is that philanthropy can't exist in the absence of grantee partners and communities. And we don't have all the answers. That's just the bottom line. And I think creating a co-partnering, co-creating, even with philanthropic partners. And that's, some folks are still used to like this more traditional way in engaging with philanthropic organizations in terms of sending a paper, writing a grant. And I recognize that that's maybe part of the process, but more being able to serve as thought partners in developing something together that might work and that's informed by community. So if we're saying that we value things that are co-created, co-designed, it'll be important for us to actually support those kind of efforts. And sometimes it requires some planning on the front end to be able to do some of that. This idea of trust-based philanthropy is another piece in terms of the types of resources and human services and at Kresge in general, but I know certainly the team that I lead, we tend to do more Gen Ops type grants. So we can focus on what we're actually trying to accomplish together in the partnership. And it's not, no judgment on anybody who tends not to do that. I'm just talking about what we do specifically. And so we found that to be very helpful to allow us to really focus on the bottom line in terms of the results from a systems change point of view. I will note that for us and Human Services at Kresge, that we are specifically interested in things that result in what we call person-centered systems change. And so it's not so much just about a program growing or getting bigger, but we think actual scale for us is a change in the system fundamentally.
And Raquel, when you say system, right? Let's bring it a little closer to home for folks when you use the term system.
Sure. Several ways to bring it closer to home. One is our fiscal and tax policy in the country, and its implications on folks who are under-resourced, who are struggling. The way that happens is concerning. That's something that is important to us. The benefits cliff that most people know about in terms of when families get penalized for progress. When we're trying to move up this economic ladder in this country. There's so many things which in regard to this system that I don't even have enough time to tell you.
No, but
I know you know them too, but that's what I mean. I'm talking about the system that could be big P, little p in terms of when you think about public sector organizations like the ones that we led. There's things that can be affected just inside of that organization relative to different types of policy interpretations. Yeah. There's state and federal rules. There's several things that need to be affected. There's when you have to do the public comments, when you have to do state plans. So there are a number of things that folks could leverage to affect systems change, and that oftentimes community doesn't know, and oftentimes social sector leaders aren't aware of as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing though for us to keep in mind too, is the big P, little p. Those of us in the public sector use that term all the time, and I think oftentimes our sector, the social sector, can get so focused on the big P policy of the legislature which is very, very important, but they don't realize the little p policies and rules, requirements, regulations, or just a Dr. Raquel Hatter or a Susan Dreyfus secretary making decisions in the shower one morning about a change we're going to make in our organization. But it matters. Little p policy can have huge repercussions. So I think that's a good thing. So I want to ask a question from our attendees. And again, I welcome anyone. If you have a question that you want to ask Raquel, she is a wide open book. I've always learned if she has it, she'll give it to you. And if she doesn't, she's going to keep making it part of your journey, right?
That's right.
But in transforming the narrative, and you mentioned this earlier, the notion of narrative, but in transforming the narrative around prevention, in particular, what do you believe we need to do to move mindsets toward a society that is around creating the conditions for all children and families to thrive versus the orientation that something, as you said, will go wrong with families? You know, that I think you really hit a chord with a lot of folks. Is that a fundamental assumption that something will go wrong versus a belief that, you know, that's not what families want, or, you know, we want to see happen.
Right.
So when you think about transforming that narrative, and specifically around prevention, that it is about primary prevention in this nation, and not constantly having to couch it in what feels like, but something could go wrong.
Right. Well, so you have an audience of no easy questions or short answers. So, you know, I think there's a need for a type of etch-a-sketch, if you will. I think that when you look at the place of start, like how this came to be, I think we have to give ourselves permission to do like a societal introspection in terms of how we got to this place that we're at, and be really honest. I mean, Susan, we talked about, like reconciliation efforts. I don't think we can gloss over the issues of inequity and injustice. That's going to be really important, because that has to do with how we started from this place in the first place. Like, how is it that we start with the lens that we do now in terms of protection? So like, protection should be the least that families should be able to realize for themselves. It is not the North Star. Yet, even with all the efforts that are taking place, we still have this struggle. So it's incumbent upon us to go figure out, what is that? So one of the things, if you're doing justice work, which I believe this work is, it requires us to do the learning to help us to understand how we got to where we are. And so often that doesn't, well-meaning people who really care and want a vision that's different in the future haven't done the homework. This is not a crash course. We have to go back, you have to disentangle it fundamentally to be able to do what I would call like an MRI on this system, and to be honest about the ways that we've all been complicit in it. I don't feel like there's some quick way to make that happen. We have to be able to do the homework from the seats that we sit in, and then to choose to design and improve upon, well, I won't say improve upon, to design a system that works. It's really, this was not, the system didn't like just create itself. This was done with intention. And so I think we have to be way more intentional in how we look at doing like an MRI on the system, and identify where the issues are and go at them one by one.
Right, right. I remember at the when we were in Alabama at the Racial Justice Initiative, Equal Justice Initiative, which was so powerful. And I remember the what the gentleman's name that leads that.
Brian?
No, Brian Stevenson, yes. Yeah. And I remember I was in a meeting with Brian Stevenson at a national level when I was CEO of the Alliance, and he looked out at all of us in the room and he said, remember, slavery in our nation did not go away, it evolved. and it evolved kind of like molasses in our veins. It's almost harder to extract it because it's gone so deep, right, into our systems now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. If we started to unpack what reconciliation would look like, a big part of that is understanding how we got here and figuring out how PCA America, in the ways that are relevant to its theory of change, could be part of that larger education role they play. Not to say, oh, ain't it awful, and who did what wrong, but just educate the country on how things have gone wrong.
That's right. No, I agree.
And what's the answer?
That's right. This is by no means an accident. Nobody could be this good at it for it to be an accident. And so I would say that we're learning a lot of, I don't know if it's lessons. I can't even describe some of the things that are taking place where I talked about Dr. Nyandoro in Jackson, where she's at. Those are facts. It's not myth. And those are real things. Those are things that matter to us here at Kresge Human Services and Kresge in general. And I think once we can get underneath the hood and really understand how these things start in the first place, it helps us to be able to unravel them. Fundamentally, we have a system of support that, quite frankly, isn't doing what it should be doing in partnership, not just in service to families and communities.
Well, I have to say, we're just a couple of minutes here, and I just want to say, as someone has come to love you and know you over many years, it's wonderful, Raquel, just to see the incredible work you're doing, but with such a humble servant heart that you've always been about, and how I've known you over the years. And I miss seeing you more often, but I'm also enjoying my second act of part-time grandma and enjoying life, but also working, consulting with organizations around the country. It's a good gig. It's a good gig, and I'm enjoying it very much. But I hope you don't mind if I end with the Raquel story. That is one of my favorite stories to tell. And that was when she was nominated by the governor to be the commissioner in the state of Tennessee. And was that Human Services?
It was Human Services under the former governor, Bill Haslam. Yeah,
fabulous governor. She was before the state senate, as I had to do when I was in Washington State, when you're up for your confirmation. And they're looking at her as she's sitting there before them. And Raquel has a doctorate degree and certainly a pretty amazing career pathway you could look at on a bio, but those things don't matter to her, but they do matter to others. And they're looking at her, and they asked her what gave her the qualifications for this job. And I love this story. She just looked at them with that ever beautiful, calm face and said, well, first I graduated from Head Start.
No doubt. There you go.
Amen.
And Susan, I'll tell you, that was after I was full-fledged commissioner.
That was after, see, I thought it was during your confirmation.
Yeah, and all I was thinking, I said to Guy, because that's how I believe, this is going to be a long list. Because I started with Head Start.
Well, listen, Raquel, I hope PCA America can stay connected to Kresge over this journey that we'll be on as an organization. And I just can't thank you enough for being so willing to share your time with us today.
Thank you as well. And I have one closing comment I want to say is I certainly have been blessed with all the opportunities I've received in the workplace and educationally, and my own life has been my greatest teacher. And combined with that, I've learned formally. I hope I'm doing what I was sent here to do in service to families and communities. Thank you all Amen. For what you do.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Susan and Raquel, for that thought-provoking conversation.